The thought here is when you understand the past and where we're at today, you're much more able to engage with the right, right wavelength. Okay, you're not guessing at where people are coming from. You have a background. It may be better than, like, no one may understand where they're coming from. Okay, but when you get a background of where our culture got to where it is today, then you have a base point from which to discuss and engage, and you can feel really good about it, like an anchor. Okay, so that's a little bit of the intention today. The material is adapted from Saving Leonardo and Faith, Hope, and Poetry by Malcolm White. So this is not me, so I can be authoritative because this is not me speaking. But I did, put the material together as well as put it all in one place. Okay, so there is a lot here. And again, feel free to raise questions. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, we begin with John 18 here. Jesus answered, "You say I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth." Right? So this key word truth comes into the picture. And then he says, everyone on the side of truth listens to me. Okay, interesting thought here, but you can get someone to be interested in truth and they're going to listen to him. And so I'm going to just start with a quick story. We went to a national basketball tournament this last week, and the coach said some interesting words to the team. He literally, they had a really bad game. I mean, they ended up 5th in the nation, so they did good. But one of their games, they were so bad, they only scored 14 points in the whole game. And in the middle of the second quarter, the coach told them, you guys gave up. I'm giving up on you. And he sat down, And that just devastated the team. I mean, they were just like talking about it with their parents, and so much so there was a parent-coach meeting and everything. And what came out at this parent-coach meeting is the coach had no idea of what the meaning of what he said was to the players. Okay, in other words, he literally didn't know that saying "I give up on you" had any impact whatsoever. He apologized, made up to the team and everything, and so things are fine, and they ended up winning the rest of their games, which is all great to hear. But point here was that what is meant versus what is heard, right? Recognizing the impact of our words. Even when we share the gospel, we have one meaning in mind. What's heard is very different, and we may think, "Oh, I barely said anything at all." And it could be like that basketball team right there, where you just created an earthquake, but you don't recognize it. And so the point here is that what is meant versus what is heard is very important. And beautification is a process of the church by which we learn what we mean and we communicate what we mean, right? In other words, it's part of this whole class is this idea of we're growing as individuals in our own meaning of our faith. And the more meaning we understand, the more we're able to communicate that meaning more and more accurately. And it's part of the beautification of the church. Because I think in a lot of ways you could say that we grow as a church in our meaning of godliness, in our meaning of all the things that God has done for us through the gospel and through His Spirit in our lives, right? So let's keep going. Truth versus fact. Okay, there's a language of truth and there's a language of fact. And this is important to clarify as we look at the art for today, okay? I don't even know if you've ever thought of the difference between truth and fact, okay? Historically, there's a huge difference. You may not recognize there's a difference because we've grown up in what's called the modern era, where truth is equal to fact, okay? But I'm going to describe some differences. Truth is holistic. It's kind of the big picture. It's an example might be like a star, okay? Is a star a ball of gas? Well, that's a fact, right? Is a flower just a biological function of a plant? What is it? Whereas a fact is a language of precision, and facts actually use a language of precision and finality that it actually can't even deliver, okay? Facts claim to be judgment-free, but facts are always based on certain sets of assumptions. For example, what is the definition of a woman? Okay, that if you use a biological definition, you come up with a fact. Okay, but that's not necessarily the holistic big picture of what is a woman. Okay, here's another one I can give you is who is I could use one of my, I guess I use my kids as an example because they're saved, right? Who is Evan, right? Well, you could describe him as a series of facts, but that would do no justice to the truth of who Evan is, right? And in that sense, truth and fact are, one is holistic and one is precision, but it's precision that's not actually all that accurate, okay? Truth recognizes that real knowledge requires trust and commitment. The language through which we know may be an essential and helpful part of knowledge itself. An example here would be like, if you want to describe a person, you probably need to use poetry. Okay? If you want to describe a person, you probably have to use photos and pictures and music, and to try to limit a person to just a set of statements. You're always further clarifying, because you can never quite capture. Okay, so facts are limited, but what's interesting is a lot of times facts operate in this idea that image and imagination cloud and obscure pure, dry knowledge. In other words, and we're going to look at this with postmodernism and everything, but this idea is that when you're stuck on facts, you think that things like poetry don't actually matter. Okay? But the truth is that poetry might reveal more truth than facts. Okay, and I'm going to give you an example of this. Another example of language of truth versus language of facts. Real knowledge involves an active synthesizing and shaping power of the mind. Okay, in other words, for you to understand a truth, your mind has to engage and be used to shape and understand. And this is why in culturally speaking, fable stories and myths were the medium that were most commonly associated with trying to communicate truth. Okay? Fables, myths, and stories were used. Whereas the language of fact believes imagination is fallen, not trustworthy, more degraded than reason. Okay? And so a good example I can give you right now is the Gospels. Okay? A lot of times we think of the Gospels in terms of facts. Okay? Are the four Gospels factually accurate? And if they're not, I don't trust them, or whatever else like that, okay? But, and there are good books on this. Actually, one of my professors was Michael Licona, one of the top New Testament professors in the entire world, written a number of books and is engaged in this topic of the New Testament quite frequently. And he'll give you an example. He actually wrote a book about this, that the New Testament is written in a language to communicate a portrait of Jesus. It's a Greco-Roman portrait, okay? In other words, imagine a collage, okay? A collage would be like an image with a lot of the things, the likes and the dislikes and the stories, all of the main events all arranged so that you get a truthful picture of who someone is, okay? That's very different than a photograph, which is like a snapshot of a moment in time. Okay? Well, when you think in terms of truth, the Gospels are given to us to communicate the truth of Jesus, like a portrait, like a collage would do. But if all you think of is in terms of facts, then you're going to say, is this accurate or not? Wait a minute, this is out of order. Why is this out of order? And you totally miss the language of truth, the communication of what's true versus facts, which actually don't communicate truth, because a photograph can be very misleading, right? It depends on the moment of time, when you caught it, the context, everything else. So truth, a portrait gives you truth, whereas a photograph gives you a fact, and it can lead you astray, whereas truth. So last thing, reason can only proceed, test, and interpret from a position of faith and trust, including trust in reason itself. Okay, so the thought here is that even facts require faith. Okay, even facts require faith. I want to bring this up because the language of truth is very important to understand as we get further into art. Okay, art plays a critical role in the communication of truth. Okay, so I just brought up this point here about the deepest truths are often found in fables, stories, and myths. That is written art. Okay, so art is defined not necessarily always as visual, but it can be poetic, it can be music. But the idea is that art plays a critical role in the communication of truth, and art is considered truth-bearing. Okay, And these are things that sometimes as believers today, we're not even educated in the least bit to understand the role of art in our faith or in life or in culture or anything. But art is truth-bearing, okay? And the idea here, Christians distinguish truth by its absolute origin, not simply by its empirical verifiability. In a Christian understanding, truth can be revealed through empirical measurements. That means things you can touch, see, and taste, right? And testing truth can also be discovered through other means such as reason or art. You could say a picture is worth more than 1,000 words, okay? Like this picture right here, this is an artwork from Norman Rockwell. You're getting communicated through this picture, a picture of a frame of this family that communicates truth that even if you tried to use words, it would be very difficult to communicate the truth of this moment. Okay? And so art is truth-bearing in that sense. Imagination precedes reason. We talked about this. Thus, art influences our perception and understanding. Okay? Again, we're going to go through a lot of this fairly quickly, so please raise your hand if I miss something or communicate something wrong. Okay? So art is truth-bearing. Art is truth-bearing. Here's another thought about this. Historically, truth has been understood as holistic. Because all things were created by a single divine mind, all truth forms a single, coherent, mutually consistent system. Truth is unified and universal. Okay? This was a Christian understanding. It was also a cultural understanding of almost every culture throughout history. Okay? And I'm going to leave out modern history. Okay? But throughout history, people have thought of truth as a holistic understanding. Art consists, by the way, I just want to define some things here. Art consists of anything imaginative, okay? Stories, fables, poetry, songs, visual. We're going to focus on the visual today, okay? But it could, just for the sake of time, okay? The modern definition of art, okay? Just to kind of orient you to a little difference here. It's the expression or application of skill and imagination to produce works appreciated primarily for their beauty or emotional power. Okay? So when you hear the word art today, most of you think of this as the definition. What you're really thinking of is a decoration. Okay? That is not the classical definition of art, and it's not the cultural or historical definition of art. Okay? Art, the ancient definition, is the expression or application of skill and imagination to produce a more truthful picture of underlying reality. The purpose of art was to gaze at truth, whether it was obvious or not, a witnessing of or a bearing of truth, a revealing of truth. Okay? So the idea is that as artists, true artists, not decorators, okay? I'm going to separate the two, okay? I'm not talking about a decorator, somebody who's trying to create something that looks good in your living room, okay? But the purpose of art was to let you gaze at something to get a better picture of reality, a truer picture of reality. Okay, are you following so far? Okay, like when you look at by the way, here's a perfect example here. The Greeks sought ultimate truth in mathematics and geometry, right? So their art, for one example of Greek art was Pythagorean art. And this is an example. Pythagorean art was very in touch with the angles and the proportions and the things and the way they connected. Because by doing so, they were creating a truer picture of reality. Okay? So when you gazed at Greek art, you were looking at something truer than you could get by just looking at a drawing that was just scribbled or scratched. Okay? So there's this association between truth and art. Art supports and feeds ideas regarding truth that are consumed and reasoned upon by culture. Okay, I don't know if you knew this, but there's a one-way arrow. Okay, the one-way arrow. What I mean by this is that art creates ideas, and the culture runs with the ideas that art creates, or you could say art liberates ideas, and then the culture runs with ideas that art creates. Okay, it's a one-way street. It never goes in reverse. Okay, and I'm going to give you an example. Artists, like philosophers, are leading thinkers. They write about the world, or they paint the world as it is becoming, or they perceive it has already become. They see it first with gifted accuracy. They experience it first. Okay? That's something to understand. Artists are truly gifted. And when you say an artist is gifted, you don't just simply mean they're gifted in their ability to use a pen or a brush or to understand color. They're gifted in the sense that they're on track with a wavelength of how people around them perceive or think. Or you could say even spiritually, they're spiritually in touch with a underlying reality that they're trying to communicate. Okay. Again, I'm not talking about a decorator. Okay, but this would be, in that sense, an artist is like a visual philosopher. Okay, they're giving out philosophies. I just want to give an example of how this works. I'm going to use the example of bell-bottom jeans. Okay, there are artists that are called designers that are sitting in, let's say, in somewhere in Europe, right, in a city in Europe, and someone comes up with this idea of a bell-bottom jean. Okay. Bell-bottom jeans may not be popular. As a matter of fact, they aren't. They don't even exist. But some artist comes up with this idea of a bell-bottom jean. Now, that didn't come out of thin air. Okay. They are in touch with the philosophies of the time. They're avid readers and understanders of what's going on, and they're very gifted in the processing of how to merge all these things in a way that can be consumed by culture. Okay. So what happened is that some artist came up with a bell-bottom jean. A new style was born. That style was not random. It was somehow very intimately linked with a philosophy. Now, that doesn't matter to culture, okay? But that doesn't mean it wasn't true. As a matter of fact, all style is intimately linked with some philosophy. We may not know it. A lot of times we don't, okay? But that style captures where society was moving. The style represents and captures that view, and all of a sudden what you find is that that artist hits a home run. Bell-bottom jeans take off, okay? Now, most of us don't know why bell-bottom jeans took off, but the person who created bell-bottom jeans was in touch with something, okay? And this is an example of what I'm trying to communicate. Now, it didn't go reverse, okay? And it's a one-way arrow, okay? The artist goes into the culture, okay? It's because you can ask the question, well, isn't it the culture that feeds the artist ideas? And the answer is no, okay? Never. I talked to Dr. Piercy in detail about this. She's a very good, very well researched, and her positions are very strong on this, that all evidence always points to a one-way arrow. Art changes the culture. Bell-bottom jeans came from an artist, and that changed the culture. Okay, it doesn't go the other way. It isn't like a bunch of people are wearing bell-bottom jeans, and all of a sudden an artist gets an idea as a result of the bell-bottom jeans. Okay, does that make sense? You following so far? It's a one-way street, and that's very important to understand. So art supports and feeds ideas regarding truth that are consumed and reasoned upon, or worn in this case, by culture. Okay. Their influence gradually percolates into the alternative and pop cultures. You know, the whole idea of the punk rockers with the, what is it called? Yeah, the Mohawk, right? You know, the Mohawk was you and I may not understand the Mohawk, but it was a style with a reason. And there was a very clear reason why that was true. But the Mohawk percolated into an alternative culture, like one of the cultures that not necessarily the most popular one. It eventually percolated into pop culture, into movies and songs. Okay? It permeates, and that's how it works. It goes from the less to the more, less to the more. But there's always some idea behind it. It doesn't matter if you know it or not. You can research it if you'd like, but who has time to go research it, right? Well, I get to, or Dr. Piercy has time, right? But we're going to look at some examples. It's a one-way arrow, okay? Art introduces or highlights reality to the public sphere, and then the public then runs with it. Another example I can give you today is in movies today, you'll see the idea of a multiverse, right? Multiverse stuff, Marvel, it's all over the place. And that's just an idea. They're having fun with it, right? But you can bet probably 20 to 30 years from now, the multiverse will become an established theory in science, okay? But it was first caught on by the artists, by the movie makers. They captured an idea that really encompassed a lot of what we don't even know all the details of why it was so fascinating. Okay, but it'll eventually show up in science. Okay, so this is an example of how art works. In this sense, artists, writers, and philosophers create the culture, never vice versa. Okay, so it's important to understand this. Art plays a critical role in culture. Even though you may not have gone to an art gallery recently, art galleries have a lot to say, but it doesn't even take a gallery because you consume movies and songs every day, and those are written by artists. Okay, because art is not just a visual art like in a gallery. Okay, let's keep going. During the Enlightenment, art withdrew its relationship with the truth. Okay, so I mentioned how art was always a way of being able to show the truth or the underlying truth, and that was even the goal of art, was to communicate an underlying truth. Well, during the Enlightenment, that was no longer true. Art began to have doubts, like, wow, does an artist really have anything to say? Because whatever couldn't be known by the scientific method just wasn't real. Okay, this became a real popular idea. Here's an example from Francis Bacon from the Enlightenment. For all that concerns ornament, speech, similitude, treasure of eloquence, and such like emptiness, let it be utterly dismissed. Thomas Pratt, the Royal Society, very influential. The Royal Society is very influential. We must separate the knowledge of nature from the colors of rhetoric, the devices of fancy, or the delightful deceit of fables. Okay, so basically, these ideas capture this idea. Art for millennia was always associated with this idea of communicating truth, and then during the Enlightenment, art was like, I don't know if an artist really has any business communicating truth. Okay, so that was happening at the time. And Immanuel Kant, very important figure. Have you heard of Immanuel Kant? Philosopher? Okay. Most philosophers, he is considered the last continental philosopher. Okay, continental philosopher would be somebody who philosophizes. Okay, nowadays you have what's called analytical philosophers. Okay, Immanuel Kant was the last one. Why? Because his writings were such a degree that you could no longer have a philosopher. Okay, but basically, most philosophers recognize that Kant was the creator of modern civilization. Okay, Immanuel Kant created modern civilization. Modernism started in 1786 with Kant's work treatise on. Here, I'll give you the exact name here in a minute. But he wrote a book. And this book, let me just give you the history real quick, okay? So we talked about this, 1500 to 1450, medieval culture, and the rise of nominalism. In other words, the rising of how nothing has value, including you as a person. Nothing has value unless you declare it has value, right? The idea of nominal, naming. Nothing has value until you declare it has value. Disease with the Black Death, new developments in the cosmos, and the printing press. It led to the Renaissance. I'm going fast so I can get to the art, okay? So you'll have to forgive me here. But that led to the Renaissance, which is advances in literature, architecture, humanism, and the creation of a world economy, right? Art was still appreciated at that time in a certain way. That led to the Enlightenment, which was the burst of the scientific method, industrialization, the idea of rationalism, astronomy, and calculus. And that is the precursor that led to Immanuel Kant, and his book was called Critique of Pure Reason. Okay, and it's considered the age, and that's what he looked like. 1781 is when he published this book. This was the beginning of the end of civilization in a lot of ways. Okay, or if you like what you're living out today, you could say he was the creator of modern civilization. Okay, now what he did. Okay, so what did he do? You might say now, he built on Hume, who was a philosopher before him, but he created this idea, okay? And the idea was that all knowledge can be separated into what's called idealism or empiricism, or you could say imaginative truths and rational truths, okay? Everything in the world can be separated into imaginative or rational truths. The truths that were imaginative are called above, you could call them, and I'm going to give you more detail about this in a minute. And the truths that were rational were called modern. Okay, above modern. Does that sound very familiar? Post-modern, right? Post means above. Okay, so he introduced this idea that there's two sets of truth. Okay, whereas since the beginning of civilization, right, you could say for thousands of years, truth was a singular understanding. Immanuel Kant introduced this idea, no, there's actually two categories of truth. There's the ideal truths and there's empirical truths. I'm going to break these down a little more, okay? And you could think of it as a two-story house, okay? So just think of a house with an upper story and a bottom story. And in this upper story, he said were things that were the mind, which he did say ultimately creates the rational world. And then the lower story were things of the body or physical, okay? The upper story truths were individual preferences. They're binding on the individual conscience. You could say it's true for you, but not true for me. Sound familiar? Okay, this is Kant. Okay, facts, whereas the lower story was facts that are binding on everyone. They should be imposed on everyone. The upper story truths were subjective. They were the product of tradition and they were irrational. You could think of church truths. Anything you believe in your faith is subjective. Whereas the lower story, those kind of truths were objective and rational. Okay, objective versus subjective. The upper story truths weren't verifiable. Hey, no one can prove your faith. Whereas the lower story truths were verifiable. Hey, I can study this and I can prove it. Okay, the upper story truths he called Hume before him labeled those as truths of the moral order, whereas the lower story truths were truths of the natural order. The upper story led to what's called the movement of what's called Romanticism. Things like God, morality, and freedom, which are not reducible to natural forces and couldn't be disproved by reason. Whereas the lower story truths led to the Enlightenment and worldviews. Okay, so in other words, what you're talking about is a big split in truth. Okay, you could say truth was divided. Okay, you went to objective versus subjective. You went to things that were considered private. In other words, they're allowed in your individual home and respected but irrelevant. And things that were public, allowed by societies and culture. In the upper story truths, you were a free agent who can make your own moral choices. Lower story truths were deterministic. In other words, they were not something you choose. They were just the way it is. Okay. The upper story truths, think of you as a person. Okay, you are the ghost in the machine. Okay, the real hero in your body. Okay, if you think about yourself as mind and body, the real hero is your mind, because it consisted of freedom and consciousness. But your mind is a prisoner in a dark room. Your body is a machine, and it's indifferent to human concerns. And so basically, your mind and your body were separated. Okay, right? So your mind is imprisoned in this robot, which is called your body. Okay. The continental tradition of philosophy, which was answering life's larger questions, the modern truths became analytical tradition in philosophy. Modern philosophy is simply just logical truths. It's exercises in logic. That's all it is. Okay. The upper story truths were inspirational, imaginative, and creative. And it was a world of beliefs, feelings, desires, goals, intentions. Okay. And whereas the lower story truths, man is a machine, and feelings and desires are irrelevant. Okay. And the upper story truths were idealism, subjective feelings, romanticism, and it led to an art form called idealism. And the lower story truths led to an art form called empiricism, an analysis of objective form. Okay. Now, I'm giving you an awful lot of information, but just want to paint a picture. Is this clear enough? Okay. Basically, truth was divided. You had subjective truths, objective truths. You live in a world of divided truths. Okay. This is the foundation from which to understand postmodernism and beyond. Okay. It's a world of truths that have been split into two. Okay. Now, here's what we're going to do. What happened is that art tried to maintain a relationship with both these houses individually. Okay. So in other words, if you look at art, you see that art either became idealistic art, or it became empirical art. Okay? So starting in the 1800s, art went two different directions. And we're going to look at both directions. Okay? First, we're going to look at idealistic art, and then we're going to look at empirical art. Okay, are you tracking so far? Is that good so far? Okay. So let's look at idealistic art. And again, when you think, remember, art is not the result of culture. Art is leading out the culture. Okay. So when you see these works and these works of art, they're not representing what's already there. They're representing what was beginning. If you ever wondered where the term postmodern came from? It's an art term. Okay. Postmodern art. Modern art. Okay, all these labels you hear out there, they're all art terms. And the reason is because the art recognized the truths long before the culture actually did. Okay, I'll give you an example. Postmodern art was out in the 50s. Okay, but postmodern culture followed 20 to 50 years after postmodern art. Okay? And the reason is because the postmodern artists were capturing something and putting it into a tangible form, and the culture had to catch up to it. Okay? So that's why these art terms are very common when you try to talk about culture or civilization. Okay? So again, when I show you these art forms, each of these led to something in civilization. Can't get into it. Why? I mean, I wish we could spend 2 hours in this class. Okay, but we don't have 2 hours. I got to put it all into a very short time. So let's get going. Okay, when truth was split, art unsuccessfully attempted to culturally feed and support an independent upper story and lower story. First, let's look at the upper story art. Art that attempted to support imaginative, subjective ideas without God. Okay, think of Ralph Waldo Emerson, okay, or Henry David Thoreau. By the severance of the poetic universe and the empirical universe, the Romantics, it was also called Romanticism when it started out, hoped to achieve the logical distinction between two kinds of universes of truth, between rational and imaginative. Okay, so in other words, artists quickly recognized what Kant was saying, and they recognized we gotta adjust our art to communicate reality. The Romantic task was inherently contradictory. The existence of the free mind of the Romantic upper story was incompatible with the lower story. Okay? And I'm just going to keep going. We don't need to look at that right now. Okay, here's some art. Expressionism. Okay, remember, this is idealistic art. The artist expresses only what he has within himself, not what he sees with his eyes. Okay, so they said, you know what? Remember, think of the upper story, nothing objective. Everything's subjective. Okay? I'm not going to paint what I see with my eyes. I'm going to paint what I have within myself. This is vision after the sermon. It's not intended to show a realistic scene. It's a flat perspective with a red background and the lack of any visible light source. It depicts the idea in the women's minds as they pray. Okay, so there's a wrestling and they see an angel and everything. So this what's being communicated here is something that's an expression versus a truth. Van Gogh, his swirling stars and writhing landscape express a vision that ultimately belongs more to the realm of religious revelation than to astronomical observations. Van Gogh wanted to be a minister. Okay? He didn't get to be a minister, but he communicated through his art. It was called expressionism. And the idea here was to paint what you have within yourself. Okay. Now, what did that lead to? Now, these might be words you can think of which you hear in culture. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think that the way it's painted has anything to do with the fact that he was technically in a mental hospital when he was painting it?
People would say that, but art, as far as anyone who's studied as well as what he says about his art, it may have influenced him. Well, I guess we wouldn't know that, but what he says about his art is extremely expressionistic. Okay, right? So. Now, here's what expressionism concluded. It attempted to illumine the world with its own light. This attempt was proven futile apart from God by its inability to do much more than reflect the light of a broken and dark world. Beauty requires something that is inherently beautiful. Expressionism increasingly faced the godless reality of a world of fragmentation, chance, chaos, and dissonance, which seemed a more fitting artistic metaphor for human experience than the formal order of established art. In other words, Expressionism tried, again, these movements tried to express without God, okay? So when Expressionism tried to express what you have within yourself, what it found was what it had within itself wasn't enough. It basically became futile, and its own light wasn't enough to be able to communicate to the world a message that was beautiful. Okay, so let's keep going. Symbolism. This example of what Coleridge said: "From the human soul issues forth whatever lightning glory we seem to find in nature, whatever sweet voice we seem to hear. The imagination does not discover beauty so much as it exercises its own beauty-making power." So somebody who is a symbolic artist believed that these dreamlike symbols had immense power because they functioned as windows into a higher reality. The natural forms are living symbols of a higher reality, and the artist's imagination was the key that could reveal these spiritual truths. Okay, so symbolism, again, without God, these artists resorted to this idea of symbolism. You know what? I'm going to communicate something through symbols of a higher reality. Okay, and this is an example of Death of the Gravedigger. It's a symbol of what's actually occurring. Now, they weren't actually talking about Jesus or God or anything spiritual. They didn't actually believe in it, but they were trying to communicate to a public that, hey, maybe what we need is symbols. Symbols will make sense of everything. This is a picture of the Isle of the Dead, where somebody goes when you die. Again, these are called masterpieces. For the truth is that artists are not godlike beings with power to create from nothing. Finite beings like ourselves do not have the power to invest the world with beauty and purpose. Okay, so symbolism ultimately failed because no matter how great the symbol was, it wasn't able to create enough symbols to actually create beauty and goodness in the culture. Okay, so, and again, I'm just giving you very few examples, but these are well researched. Okay, I can only give you a few examples for the sake of time. Yes.
How do they measure that these weren't enough in the previous paintings?
Yeah, and I wish I could show that to you, but like these are just a very small part of a movement called Expressionism, right? So I'm putting into like 2 to 3 minutes what's really, you could study out Expressionism and its effect on culture, right? And so there'd be a lot there. This was a conclusion. And part of the conclusion was mainly based on the fact that Expressionism died. In other words, Expressionism turned into something else because it wasn't able to communicate what it was hoping to communicate. And same thing with symbolism. Symbolism died as a movement because the artists, the goal of these artists was they were trying to communicate beauty and goodness without God, right? This subjective area of life. There was subjective and there was objective. They wanted to communicate the subjective area of life and they wanted to treat it like reality. And so they were trying to find different ways of doing this. And the fact that these movements each died was somewhat of a communication, but there was also a lot of writing and because it wasn't just art. Okay, the symbolism movement was also, it was seen in literature and poetry and everything also. Yeah. The culture actually did ingest all of these different movements, but their effect on culture wasn't what was the goal, you could say, right? Which was to create beauty and goodness in and of itself, right? So what you're seeing here is that apart from Jesus, every attempt to support a subjective form of life just couldn't uphold culture. Okay, and again, I can't do it in the realm of this class because it's just too short. But there's all the writings around symbolism all pointed to this idea that this power to create from nothing just couldn't do it. It didn't have enough substance to it. So those are very good questions. I just wish I could give you more, right? So what I'm doing is summarizing the pantheistic art. Okay, there is bimorphic abstraction. And the idea was the collapse of the atom model was equated in my soul with the collapse of the whole world. Suddenly the stoutest walls crumbled, science seemed destroyed. Its most important basis was only an illusion. I'm sorry, I forgot the artist's name right there. Indeed, is there even such a thing as matter? Okay, right? So basically they started thinking, with certain developments in culture, the idea was, you know what, maybe, when they came into atomic theory, the idea was the world is made up of atoms. Hey, well, maybe if you can't see atoms, then maybe they don't even exist. And so a whole series of art came with this idea that, you know what? I want to express things. Let me go and read the rest of it. Zen Buddhism, which teaches that the way to quiet the mind and attain alignment is to free oneself of all desires. Okay. This is about Cage. Let me go ahead and share with this one first. Okay. But so Cage decided that the composer should not impose his own likes and dislikes on tones. Instead, he should treat every sound as an equally valid form of music. To eliminate his power of choice and control, he began to compose music using chance methods such as tossing dice and consulting the Chinese I Ching to decide what the next note should be. Okay. So they started making music using randomness, because they didn't want to impose any kind of order from this whole world, right? Because the thought here is that all of everything that's important is just an illusion. Okay, and so this right here is an example of an abstraction where basically everything comes from things that you can't put it. Everything dissolves into invisible forces. Okay, so the idea here was that was these movements that were trying to make sense of Eastern pantheism. Okay, Eastern pantheism leads to such a low view of the person is that it has a non-personal starting point. Basically, the problem with pantheism and art that tried to pretend like everything came from nothing. Okay. Was that meant that everything, including you, came from nothing. Okay, so it was a low view of humanity. Its deity is not a personal God who thinks, acts, and feels, but a non-cognitive spiritual essence. That's why, surprising as it may sound, pantheism is not really all that different from materialism. It is the flip side of the same coin. Materialism states that everything consists of material stuff. Pantheism states that everything consists of spiritual stuff. Both are non-personal. As a result, both worldviews fail to account for human personhood. The goal is not to suppress our desires, but to direct our desires to what truly satisfies. Okay, so the thought here was that the more someone tried to communicate through ideas of everything is the same thing, or everything is not coming from some rational order, but it dissolves into some invisible force that's all around us, the more impersonal it became. Just like when you listen to a bunch of random sounds. Okay, those random sounds, when you hear them, they're just impersonal. They mean nothing to you, right? So culture recognized this. When culture would look at this art and the ideas that it represented, it tried to support pantheism in culture, and it just failed. Okay, I hope that's clear enough. And again, we can't get into the history of how this failed, but it wasn't enough. Abstract expressionism, Rothko. He became convinced that every particular concept of the divine is too limited and must be transcended. Thus, the huge, almost undifferentiated color fields were intended to suggest that ultimate reality cannot be identified with any definite or specific image of the divine. Okay. By the way, something you can see here, these guys are preachers. Okay. You always wonder, like, how the heck did this get popular, right? But anyone who's into high art recognizes they're looking at it and they're reading about it and they're in touch with the philosophies of what's happening. Okay. So this was communicating something very clear. The concept of the divine is too limited and must be transcended. Thus, the huge, almost undifferentiated color fields were intended to suggest that ultimate reality cannot be identified with any definite or specific image of the divine. In negative theology, we can make no positive statements about who or what the divine is. We can approach a truth only through the negation of images. These artists renounce rules and methods as nothing but dead conventions. Their goal was the free unleashing of inner energies and impulses from the unconscious. Looking at a work of art, you're no longer supposed to ask, is it a good example of the rules of the craft, but only does it express the artist's inner vision? Okay. Once again, subjective to the nth degree. Subjective. Now, what's interesting is that Rothko, this is a work of Rothko. This isn't actually a church. It was called The Unbearable Silence of God, right? It's just, it's literally nothing. Yet if you cannot identify the divine in any positive way, how do you even know it is real? How do you know there's really is a spiritual presence that you're experiencing and not just an illusion or wish fulfillment? After completing the panels, these are the panels that Rothko made for a chapel. Even before it opened, Rothko committed suicide. Again, remember, these artists are very, very in touch with philosophies and understanding of everything. He committed suicide from this. An undefined mysticism with nobody there is not enough. It does not fill the hunger in the human heart for connection with a personal God who knows and loves us all. If humans are intrinsically good, then how did cultures become evil and corrupt? Cultures can only reveal the character of those who created them. In addition, we're far more aware today of the ineradicable power of evil, having witnessed the horrors of 2 world wars, Nazi concentration camps, the Gulag, the killing fields of Cambodia, genocide, so on and on. Okay, so the thought here, by the way, the 1900s were a complete dismal failure. Okay, right? A lot of these works of arts were from the 1900s. Okay, and they represented what came first in a lot of ways. Okay, but the point here was that was this idea of expressionism that was abstract was a failure because you had nothing to lean on. There was nothing solid, and the artwork pointed it out. The more you tried, the more you realized there's nothing you could actually lean on, and it felt more and more like you're just more alone than ever. Okay, so the attempt was to create beauty and spirituality, but the result was culture recognized that the more it attempted so, the more it felt empty. Okay? By the way, you could also call this the collapse of modernism. Existentialism. Existentialists attempted to portray a world where there's no human nature because there's no God to have a conception of it. Instead, they created their paintings through unpremeditated, spontaneous action. They defined art not in terms of its end result, which was the painting, but in terms of the action of creating it. The physical gesture of slinging paint on canvas. Okay, right? So that's what this was, right? So we don't recognize it. You just look at it and think, what a piece of junk, right? But the art was the actual act of creating it. As art critic Harold Rosenberg says, for the action painters, a canvas was not a space on which to reproduce images or express feelings, but an arena in which to act. The artist literally sought to create his personal identity through the act of artistic creation. He gesticulated upon the canvas and watched for what each novelty would declare him and his art to be. So he was waiting for you to determine what you think of it. Okay. The action painters were expressing the refusal of values, explains Rosenberg. The gesture on campus was a gesture of liberation from value, political, aesthetic, and moral. By giving up all compositional conventions, consciously or not, they were conveying the existentialist theme that there were no binding moral or intellectual ideas. There is only the endless flux of life. Think of, I shared with you the myth of Sisyphus. You know, the idea was roll a ball up a hill, it comes back down, and what's your job is to roll it back up, but to do it with resolve over and over again. This is the artistic form. The most consistent expression of existentialism was the theater of the absurd. In Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, 2 characters engage in meaningless dialogue while waiting for someone who never shows up. Okay, this was theater of the times. Waiting for Godot, and this is high society, okay? At the least, you want to know what's going on with this stuff, okay? It was, I'm sorry?
Pretty sure it's pronounced Godot.
Okay, Godot, thank you. I'm not cultured enough, right?
So stupid enough to be French.
Yes, okay, there you go, yes. So that's what's going on with existentialism. And you know what the problem there? Existentialists attempted to portray a world where there's no human nature because there's no God to have a conception of it. In existentialist literature, the narrative line is lost and the story seems pointless because life is reduced to an endless, meaningless present. As Camus summarizes, we must live as if things mattered. Yes? Yeah.
So, like, I mean, I'm just like thinking of my spouse. You know,
Okay.
he gets so angry at these kinds of paintings.
Yeah.
Like existentialism in particular.
Sure.
And the one before, what was that?
Ex-
Abstract expression.
yeah.
And he gets so angry, and I wonder if like something that like the art draws out is like the very point, like, but it's like maybe he just doesn't agree with
Yeah.
the messages and values.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
By people being so repulsed by those messages.
Absolutely.
Are,
Yeah, you could say, yeah, when you watch Jackson Pollock paint this, because that was the thing, you could watch him just slinging paint, and you're just thinking, that's not it, that's not it, that's not paint, right? There is a repulsion there, that's exactly right. But for someone who's godless, this was an attempt, an extreme attempt. See, we can't even imagine this, but you got to put yourself in the mindset, a world without God, right? In a world without God, this is incredibly important, incredibly important. It's attempts to create beauty and goodness, right? And so without understanding this, you miss a lot of understanding of where people are coming from. You miss the wavelength, right? You also miss how relevant the gospel is, okay? When you understand this stuff for what it is, you get a lot more out of it, right? Okay, so we must live as if things matter. So the point is that these attempts at gathering meaning or beauty failed in culture, okay? Modernism. So the failure of Romanticism, I just want to bring this up. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said it in his Nobel lecture on literature, okay? He described the romantic as an artist who sees himself as the creator of an independent spiritual world. He hoists onto his shoulders the task of creating this world, but he crumples beneath it, for a mortal genius is not capable of bearing such a burden. Okay, right? So his point is that the romantic artists, with all of their attempts, it was impossible for them to bear the burden of creating truth and goodness in the world. Okay, so in other words, you could say Romanticism failed. Okay, now let's go to the other half. Oh, let's finish here. Romanticism carried an impossible burden only fit for God. We are created to discover beauty, not create it. We are created to discover the purposes that God has placed in nature, not to manufacture our own purposes. The results of four romantic art movements demonstrate this hopelessly impossible task. Actually, we just looked at them. I cut and pasted this in the wrong place. Okay, right. So this was to show you one of the things we learned from modernism was this idea that you cannot create beauty. Okay, and this can help you when you're in your cultural apologetics, to be honest, right? Anyone who talks about something that's pretty or whatever, we can reference a lot of this, okay? Let's keep going. These and other failures of romantics of shouldering the task of creating the world opened the door to postmodernism because their disillusionment led to the idea that life's higher meaning is essentially non-rational, okay? They're saying, you know what, you can't figure it out, okay? That's where this statement came from, okay? It's from a history of, you can encompass it all in art, okay? But it was a history of trying. Okay, let's keep going. Now, the review again, there's an upper story and there's a lower story. Now let me show you the lower story art, okay? This is the empiricism or empirical art. You guys tracking? Are we okay? Okay, empirical art. When truth was split, art unsuccessfully attempted to culturally feed an upper... Okay, I already shared that with you. Let's look at the lower start. Okay, it attempted to support machine reason and logic without God. Okay, so this other stream of art said, forget all the subjective stuff. Art must be objective. It must make crystal clarity with facts and reason and mathematics, science. Okay, so there's a whole stream of art movements that tried to do this. Okay, so let's look at this. Realism saw art as a means of reporting objective and value-free material facts regarding the world. Goyer summarizes, only paint what the eyes see, a world naked of saving grace. See, what do you see here? Mechanized cruelty, It's emotionless. It's merely a record of a historical fact. Okay? It's just historical, man. It happened. This is the execution of an emperor. I'm sorry, I forgot to put the title of the artwork here. But this is an example. Manet, I think M-A-N-E. Manet is the author. Is the artist here. But you see, this is called empirical art because it's the exact opposite. Forget it all. Nothing subjective, everything objective. Literary naturalism. Jack London, The Call of the Wild, portrayed humans as biological organisms resulting from evolutionary forces. Right? So the idea here was you're nothing but evolution. So The Call of the Wild is all about the call that he felt because of his evolutionary drive. Right? So this was an empirical art form in writing. Okay? Materialism arose from an empirical view that saw matter as the fundamental creative force. Right? So materialism said, so again, same idea. If there's no God, the idea here was let's make an idol out of stuff. And everything that happens is a result of the stuff that surrounds you. The creative force of life is actually the stuff that surrounds you. And that's what materialism is all about. Okay, right? So, you following that? Yes.
So, how do I even say this? It's possible that these were happening at the same time.
They were absolutely, yes.
Which it can lead to some of the chaos of some say this, some say this.
Yes.
But then were these artists necessarily thinking, oh, I definitely fit into this line of art?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they were, absolutely. See, that's the thing that's interesting. Again, not a decorator, right? Where somebody's just kind of sitting in their living room and painting a flower. Okay, that's not these artists, and that's actually why these people are so famous, right? Is their art, they were basically visual philosophers. And they fit very clearly into camps. Even the discussion and dialogue and everything very clearly organizes their thinking. And so yes, and this was a war between Romanticism and empiricism. And they were as they kind of grew out of Kant. Okay, so Kant published his treatise and then his book. And after that, there was a war with the different art forms, Romanticism and empiricism. And each of these formed, as each art form failed, it was taken over by another art form. And again, the idea was still the same. There was still Christian art at this time also, right? Now, the Christian art was very different, as you can imagine. But these are the secular art forms which we're talking about. So this is an example. So you can see everything is coming from matter. Matter was a fundamental art form. And so materialism, the whole idea is materials are fundamental to the creative force of life itself, right? I mean, you could call it idolatry in art form, right? But that's what it was all about, okay? Impressionism, okay? Focused on color patches. This is Monet, right? Monet, color patches. Now, you've ever wondered what was Monet all about? His philosophy, and he was very clearly a philosopher, okay? Basically, what he thought in terms of is one of raw, primal, and pristine sensations where knowledge of the world originates. In other words, Impressionism was this idea that there were sensations that created everything, okay? And so that's exactly what he's painting, was sensations. But so there's these patches, raw and primal patches, and they created what we call images. And that's why you call it Impressionism. Right? But it was very much a philosophical idea. This was not about the beauty of the work. It was the beauty of the philosophy and how it captured the underlying ideas that enamored the world. Right? Impressionists inclined towards art that provided a slice of life. Okay, I'm going to give you that as an example. Avoiding focal points and foreground, background distinctions. Impressionist music reflected similar sentiments. Clearly, Monet was not interested just in painting pretty pictures. He was wrestling with the philosophical problem of knowledge, not in philosophical terms, but in artistic terms. Okay? This is part of the human experience. People don't just think rationally and it's brilliant. This is the brilliance of the visual aspect of humanity. But it's the brilliance apart from God, right? Okay, but so they're thinking about this stuff. Geometric formalism. By the way, I'm going to go back to the slice of life. I think I put it in a separate slide. Geometric formalism, primarily cubism, imposed a rational formal order by interpreting nature in terms of the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone. Purely mathematical. Okay, right? So the idea was art had to be mathematical. That's why the clean lines and the angles and everything. Okay, so this is expressing again, it's an empirical art. Futurism celebrated the newly industrialized world by depicting nature as inferior to manufactured items. In futurism, humans were reduced to machines, right? So in futurism, you understand that people are less, not more, than the machines that surround them. The ultimate goal, and this gets into a little bit of transgenderism here, okay? But the idea here, and again, it may be so foreign to your thinking because you know Jesus who anchors you in the truth, okay? But without Jesus, anything goes, okay? So futurism, that's where this came from. And this is a whole cultural set of ideas. Musical modernism, atonality, polytonality, polyrhythm, and other math-based tones. So the idea here was the exact opposite of random dice. This was music that was created by computers, you could say, right? Everything is mathematical formulas. Stravinsky, The Rite of Spring, right? Those were actually, it's called musical modernism. So when you hear of modernism in music, it's actually mathematical. Okay, right? So everything there, in other words, you could say there's nothing subjective about it. It was all formulas. Positivism, okay, right here. This is a slice of life. Okay, you use that term in church, so I liked it. It reminded me of this. What marks the modern age is the loss of the conviction that there's a meaning or order or plan. Kennedy says, it seemed that all we really know is immediate experience, the small and commonplace fragments of the infinitely complex world. Art began to reflect that sense of fragmentation. Instead of telling a story or conveying a moral theme, the goal was to capture a fleeting moment, like a snapshot. When philosophers said the path to truth was to clear the mind of all interpretation, artists said about showing what an uninterpreted world looks like. Okay? So philosophically, hey, there's no interpretation. You don't even see the heads of the ballerinas, right? It's unimportant. What matters is this was a slice of what happened in your world. Right? So basically life is made up of a series of slices, and it's an infinitely complex world. Okay? Logical positivism, I'll give you some conclusions after all this. I just want to show you all these. Combined empiricism's emphasis on sensation, rationalism's emphasis on math and necessary reasoning. It led to the abandonment of traditional philosophy and the birth of analytical philosophy. Okay, I mentioned that. Analytical philosophy is just about, is just basically a bunch of series of logical statements. Okay, analytical philosophy's goal was to cut the verbal clutter, clear away abstract terms and metaphysical speculations. This reductionist approach in turn spawned minimalist art. Minimalism reduced art to its bare materials, right? So minimalism was an idea that, hey, you know what? Cut the clutter. Let's just get down to the basics. Let's get down to the logical truth of the matter, as if there is such a thing by itself. So that was the idea of logical positivism. Formalism. Art should be merely a record of sensations, visual and auditory effects. Edgar Allan Poe put the same idea more bluntly. Art has no concern whatever with duty or truth. The story was that there was no story. You see, this is a Whistler right here. Writes a critic, Robert Hughes. The woman was merely a model posing in Whistler's studio to give him a pretext to paint shades of white with extreme virtuosity and subtlety. The painting was to be evaluated solely in terms of formal elements, color, line, shape, texture, and so on. Hey, forget the picture of what it means altogether. All that matters is the lines, right? The colors, the shades. You're missing the whole point. It's not the picture. It's just all the formal elements of the picture. That was called formalism, right? And then geometric formalism, same idea. Attempted to purify art by eliminating all traces of particular or individual objects. Everything blends away. Forget it all. Now again, if you put this into philosophies about people, you'll get an idea of where this is all going. Okay, right? So, formalism, geometric formalism. See the radical difference between empirical art and romantic art? They're completely different, and even their approach. So the failure of empiricism. The consequence of those secular views is inevitably dehumanizing. The reason is that secularism in all its forms is reductionistic, right? Everything, all of it's trying to take away the humanity. A worldview that does not start with God must start with something less than God, something within creation, which then becomes the category to explain all of reality. Think back to Walker Percy's metaphor of a box. Empiricism puts everything in the box of the senses. Rationalism puts everything in the box of human reason. Anything that doesn't fit into the box is denied, denigrated, or declared to be unreal. The diverse and multifaceted world God created is reduced to a single category. Humans, too, are stuffed into the box. Thus, every idol is ultimately dehumanizing, leaving a wreckage of pain and alienation in its wake. Okay? Now, if you think about this, anybody who struggles with transgender, okay, the idea here is exactly what's captured by empiricism, right? I am a machine. I don't matter. I am reduced down to my biology. Okay? But there's a mind. There's a separate set of, quote, subjective truths that says that my mind is captured in this body, right? And the two are no longer together. They're separated. And what you have is a person at war because of a whole 200 years of living in a culture at war with truth. Okay? And so you could say in one sense, transgenderism had to be found in culture. It was the conclusion of culture. I mean, it was a conclusion of these forms of ideas. Okay, let's keep going. Secularists may be skeptics, but in relation to their own God substitutes, they're true believers. To adapt an observation from Lewis, their skepticism is only on the surface. It is for use on other people's beliefs. They're not nearly skeptical enough about their own beliefs, right? So the one thing these artists didn't capture was the fact that what they were doing should be seen through the same lens as what they're putting on everyone around them, right? Okay. The Bible defines idolatry as a human tendency to elevate something in creation to the status of God. In Romans, right, the Apostle Paul writes, they exchange a truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. Humans are inherently religious, and when they deny the Creator, they'll fasten on something within creation and elevate it to an object of worship. In practical life, people who reject God will seek some substitute, emotional fulfillment, power, profit, or pleasure. In intellectual life, they will seek some substitute to play the role of the divine in their thinking, the ultimate reality, the source of everything else. Worldviews are idols of the heart, right? We talked about this. There are no atheists. In cultural apologetics, you realize nobody's an atheist. Everyone has one of these. You could say everyone fits into one of these art forms because this was humanity at its finest, trying to wrestle with it. Okay, and the conclusion: the road to postmodernism. Okay, I'm going to give you this. The explanatory power of reason was eroded by the growing doubt introduced by non-Euclidean math, relativity, and quantum mechanics. Okay, how are we doing on time? 7:11. Okay, I'm going to try to make this very, very fast. Now, you guys don't realize this, but there were three, non-Euclidean math, relativity, and quantum mechanics shook up the 1900s, okay? Shook up everything relating to the belief systems of the world, okay? Non-Euclidean math, the discovery that logical truth could be separated from physical truth was devastating. Okay, what the idea is that everything we learned about geometry, it only applied to one plane. And then you went to a different plane and you had a different set of math, different set of geometry. Okay, that totally destroyed a lot of the ideas of rational views of the world. I mean, in ways that you may not understand, okay? But historically, you have to understand how big it was. It was huge, okay? Here's what it did. Ever since the ancient Greeks, most Westerners had assumed that reality is ultimately rational, that what is logically true is also really true. The new geometries challenge a conviction. Too Euclidean, critics charge. A non-Euclidean approach recognizes that different cultures begin with different moral axioms, resulting in different moral systems. All of them equally valid relative to the cultural context. That sound familiar? That's postmodernism. Okay. Likewise, in legal theory, Jerome Frank of Yale Law School argued that the traditional understanding of law was too Euclidean. In political theory, Charles Beard dismissed foundational American institutions such as balance of powers as too Euclidean. Okay? And the idea was that if everything is based on a certain set of beliefs, those beliefs may not be true. And everything that goes with it could disappear, right? This was because Euclidean math was introduced and it totally shook up the world. Okay, you have to understand this was part of the history of the world. Okay, and it went further into relativity, right? Time and space with Einstein. It basically, things are relative to the observer's frame of reference. The public had little idea what relativity meant scientifically, but they eagerly interpreted it as support for moral and cultural relativism, the denial of all absolute truths. Einstein emphatically denied that his theory implied relativism. Okay? Nevertheless, his theory was greeted with a barrage of newspaper articles interpreting it as an attack on absolutism. Even artists and writers applied it to their work. Okay, so relativity was about science and dealing with light, the speed of light and everything, right? But the idea of relativity became firmly ingrained in the 1900s, and it was carried on by the artists to a point where relativity started being applied to everything in life. Moral and cultural also, okay? But it had no basis other than the ideas of relativity. Last one, quantum mechanics. The act of observation is essentially an act of creation. The observer creates what he observes. I don't know if you knew this about quantum mechanics, but basically it states that what you see changes what was there. And I can't get into all the math of it for time, okay? The observer creates what he observes. This seems to harmonize with the occult worldview of Eastern religion, which teaches that reality is ultimately mental or spiritual, that the material world is a creation of consciousness, right? So quantum mechanics came along and said, hey, what the heck, right? So what all these things did together, the conclusion was that natural science does not consist solely in empirical discoveries. It's a rich network of ideas intricately connected to the other parts of culture. Science is only a product of human culture. The upper story of the house wins, but no clear path forward. Okay, right? So amazingly, out of the subjective and objective that Kant created, the end result of 200 years was that the subjective wins. Okay? Because of the destruction of the objective. And so what are you left with? These twin factors, skepticism introduced by scientific advances together with the failure of romantics to bear the burden of creating the world, led to the rise of postmodernism. Okay? So now what you've done is you've been caught up to where postmodernism came from. This idea, it wasn't just out of nowhere. Okay? Culture basically wrestled for 200 years. In postmodernism, self becomes a creator of its own universe. The postmodern self-surveys the world and is free to impose upon it whatever mental or moral construction it chooses. Hey, I can do whatever I need to do. Now, the key here is this isn't where we are in 2023, 2024. Okay? So last thing, implications. I'm going to finish with this. When understanding the context, the no absolutes mantra makes much more sense. Our ideas matter much more than raw facts. Okay? Now you can understand why someone says there's no absolutes. Okay? And you can understand what they mean by it and what they wish they meant by it. Okay? In other words, go before Kant. So when someone says there are no absolutes, you can understand what they're trying to say versus what they want to say, which is pre-Kant, which is, hey, there is such a thing as truth. Okay? They want to say it, but they can't. The ultimate ideas, the ones we must cling to, are the ones that are both fascinating and truth-based, myth and truth. The gospel, this is the gospel with a renewed emphasis on the imaginative aspect, right? So this isn't the history of the last 200 years is what happens when we try to be too objective or too subjective instead of merging the two together, right? But you know what Christianity is? It's both, right? It's a subjective inner working of your walk with God, and it's an objective. This is Jesus died on the cross as a resurrection fact. I mean, his resurrection and his death is a fact of history, right? So you have myth. In this sense, myth is the subjective aspect of your faith, and the fact is the resurrection. See, God joined the two together in the gospel. And that's why the gospel is so powerful in culture. Because the gospel is an anchor from which the subjective and the objective can be brought back together. Okay? And this is something badly needed by the world that's around us. Okay? In the absence of guiding ideas, postmodern culture is left to disillusionment and helplessness, which leads to anger. Lost identity and a lack of wholeness. We're always having to choose between our heart and our mind. The two are only compatible in Christ. Okay? So what you see in postmodernism, this is why even today you see things like Black Lives Matter and you see anger, movements based on anger. The idea here is a sense of disillusionment and helplessness, because there's no way to bring subjective ideas and objective ideas together except in Jesus. See, this is why you hold the keys to the cultures of the world. And this is why I think why we should always be thinking in terms of, if a culture is not completely enamored by the gospel, you have to ask why. Right? What message are you communicating? Is it all facts? Is that what you're communicating in the gospel? Is that what your faith is? Is it all subjective? Is that what you're communicating in the gospel? Is it something that's holistic and is able to meet the demands of a world that's already tried and has already failed in every other way? Okay? So, the gospel story and implications are relevant when framed and delivered in our modern context of need. Postmodern culture creates the need for which we have the answers. We just have to better understand what needs the Holy Spirit is creating in order to cooperate with Him. Right? So if we don't understand where culture's at, then you could sit there and share fact after fact after fact and miss the fact that that's not necessarily what people are wanting. But if you're sharing just story after story after story, you're missing it all also. But when you can merge the two, and I'll give you an example of transgender, right? The story of wholeness, the Holy Spirit, that is a bearing of truth in the heart of somebody struggling with transgender. Okay? You can be whole. You can live a whole life. You don't have to live in two worlds as a mind trapped in a body. Right? You don't have to do that. You can be whole. And that's a message of hope. That's a message that is actually the only message that can contradict or counter the message of the culture today. Okay? So this message of wholeness is actually a critical aspect of the message of the gospel. And I don't know if we realize it, but that's also an example of bringing meaning and blessing through the gospel. Okay? So let me just give you the homework. This is for those of you who are taking the class for credit. Okay? I need you to write a 1 to 2 page paper summarizing the thoughts and ideas from this class. Okay? So if you want credit, that's what you need to do. Okay? Next week, we're going beyond postmodernism. Okay? What I shared with you actually doesn't necessarily characterize today. And we're going to get into modern movies, songs, books. And then the other thing I want to do next week, I hope you understand what I've done in 8 weeks is I've gone through 3 years of material. I understand it's way too much, okay? Way too fast. What I've done is actually modeled for you to some degree. I've imaginatively engaged you or immersed you into a bunch of material from which now you can reason, okay? Now, but the reasoning part must occur. Okay. Now, the only way I can think of doing it, one is by doing it in the next class, okay, because not all of you are going to want to continue, okay. The other way is by having like either a bi-weekly or once a month where we can talk and you can reason away, okay, because that's what I've appreciated about all your questions. Don't worry, I'm saving each one of them. They're just so good, okay. You got some really good questions. Those are the reasoning part. Right? And we must do that. You have to reason. But I wanted to fill you with the imagination first. Okay? Now, obviously, there's a lot here, too much information to put it all together. But that's what your mind starts doing. Hey, is this important? Is this meaningful? How is this meaningful? What do I do with this? How do I make sense of this for my own life, for those around me? How do I turn this into a conversation? There's all kinds of good communication. We'll start on that next week. Okay, with modern movies, songs, and books, and then hopefully we'll continue beyond. Okay, any last questions?